Hey everyone, tonight we start with a group of men who fought with nature for most of their lives and sometimes lost fingers in the process. The men of the mountains, those half-wild trappers and travelers who lived in the frozen heart of North America long before central heating or smart choices were made. So, before you get too comfortable, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. The mountain men weren't heroes. They were the kind of people who looked at the edge of the map and thought, let's see what's past that terrible idea. Most of them were failed farmers, veterans who couldn't settle down, or men who had simply run out of people who would put up with them. Civilization was too loud, too organized, and too critical. So they put their bad life choices in bags and walked straight into winter. They went west. In the early 1800s, people came to the area because of the fur trade and the chance to get rich. But getting rich mostly meant not starving to death while chasing beavers through waist-deep snow. The job description was easy to understand. You could get frostbite and bring back something worth selling after spending 6 months in the mountains. The average life expectancy was one bad campfire away from being over. There were no hotels, no thermoses, and no news about the weather. There was only a man, his gun, and a nagging feeling that he had made a huge mistake. At night, when the wind howled through the trees, it didn't sound like poetry. It sounded like the universe was laughing. Their relationship with the cold was personal. You didn't try to fight it. You made a deal with it. You made a fire out of frozen wood and sat close to it, shivering like a philosopher, hoping the wind wouldn't blow sideways. If it did, good job. Your only source of warmth just turned into smoke and sadness. They ate things that would make a raccoon sick, like beaver tail, raw marrow, and meat that was so old it was no longer edible, qualified as history. Anything that didn't crunch when it wasn't supposed to was gourmet. But the calories kept you alive, and that was all that mattered. But they stayed, even though they were unhappy, because the wilderness had something that civilization didn't. Be quiet, the kind that made you feel small and like you had made a mistake by coming here. It made me feel small. It might even be spiritual, but most of the time it was just cold. People today freak out when the power goes out for 2 hours. The mountain men would have. That was a warm afternoon. They weren't safe, clean, or comfortable, but they were alive, and in their frostbitten minds, that was enough to win. They weren't made differently. They were just made to be colder. The first thing every mountain man learned, usually the hard way, was that the cold doesn't care about you. It doesn't care if you live or die. You can't scare it, bribe it, or talk it into doing what you want. If you want to, you can scream at the wind all night, but the wind has better things to do. People in the city today say they can beat the weather by wearing heated jackets or moving to Florida. The mountain men knew better. You can't beat the weather, you just have to deal with its mood swings. They learned this early on, when they were standing in snow up to their ribs with a piece of flint in one hand and regret in the other. They had a business relationship with the cold. It was something you respected, and it sometimes let you wake up. You got too sure of yourself, and it reminded you who owned the land. The cold wasn't out to hurt anyone. It worked well. It didn't waste time punishing you. It just sat there and waited for you to mess up. They saw new people coming from the east, young dreamers who thought a wool coat was all they needed. By nightfall, those dreamers had turned into shivering philosophers, thinking about their choices and their own deaths at the same time. A veteran trapper could always tell a new person by how loudly they cursed the snow. The old pros didn't care. You only curse at people who listen. There was no if about frostbite. It was a time. Fingers, ears, and noses, they all had dates when they would end. You didn't say anything. You just learned how to do everything with your left hand. They knew that pain would go away, but being stupid could kill them. The cold didn't care about bad planning. That was just morning when your beard froze solid and your coffee turned to slush before you could drink it. They didn't make the thermometer. They already had a better way to do things. Make another fire if the whiskey froze. If you froze, you probably wouldn't make the same mistake again. That's what made them different from the rest of us. We don't like the cold. They knew it was a rule of nature. They didn't try to stop it. They changed until the frost couldn't tell if they were alive or just part of the landscape. Because the truth that the mountain lived by is still the simplest. The cold doesn't care. It just sits there. In the mountains, quiet isn't the same as peace. It's a sign. The mountain men learned that right away. You didn't just hear the cold. You got rid of it. The way you breathe, the way it hung in the air told you how close death was that day. The world was a long, soft whisper, the sound of snow, wind, and your stomach telling you that you shouldn't have eaten breakfast. They called it the quiet white, not because it was beautiful, but because it was real. You could scream into it, and the echo would die faster than a campfire in a storm. The mountains didn't care how you felt. They wanted people to do what they said. People who didn't listen became the main characters in someone else's cautionary tale. Every mountain man could read snow like it was the Bible. The cold was bad if it squeaked when you walked on it. It was possible to live through if it crunched. If it didn't make a sound at all, good job. You were in trouble. They could smell a storm coming, taste the air for ice, and feel the pressure drop in their bones. People today use a weather app, just like the mountain men did. They knew how to walk on snow without sinking, how to make a fire that didn't go out, and how to find a place to stay. By looking at shadows. You didn't wonder, you saw. When the wind changed, it meant that a storm was planning something for itself. When the woods went quiet all of a sudden, it meant that something nearby was thinking about eating you. Animals were also meteorologists. When the crows flew low, it meant snow was coming. It was already here when the wolves stopped howling. You learned to pay attention to everything. The sound of trees, birds, and your own heart beating. Intuition is what modern society calls it. The mountain men called it paying attention. They didn't make it because they were tougher. They lived because they paid attention. People who respected the wilderness were kind to it, but everyone else was cruel to it. You can't get that level of awareness from a podcast. You learn it by being stuck in a snowstorm for 3 nights, eating frozen jerky, and realizing that nature doesn't give you your money back. The white silence didn't win over the mountain men. They learned to speak its language slowly, quietly, and with frost on their beards all the time. For a mountain man, heat wasn't a good thing. It was money. The universe paid you for every spark, ember, and half-dead flame by saying, "Congratulations, you get to live another hour." People today think warmth is a basic right. People who lived in the mountains thought it was a miracle. They used flint, frozen fingers, and the growing feeling that God was laughing to turn up the heat. It wasn't a skill to make a fire in a blizzard. It was a fight with nature, and nature always had the best lawyers. They carried tinder like it was gold, pieces of bark, dry moss, and cloth that hadn't yet turned into iron. They knew how long a single log would burn, how quickly snow could put out a fire, and how many curses it took for smoke to turn into fire. 7 on average. It felt holy when you finally saw that flicker of orange light in the dark. But fire wasn't just for warmth. It was being with someone. The only thing that answered back was the campfire, which crackled, hissed, and giving light to a world that wanted you to leave, sitting next to it, covered in animal skins. You didn't think about philosophy or poetry at all. You thought about how long it would last, and if your boots would catch fire before your toes froze. The fire taught you how to be efficient. You learned how to cook everything on coals, including meat, snow, and hope. You stopped making coffee because it froze halfway through. You ate it like a popsicle and said it was frontier style. They knew that warmth was short-lived, delicate, and always made twice as much, once with sweat and once with smoke. The wind took it if you weren't careful. If you slept too close, the sparks got you. Fire required respect, just like the cold. The mountain men didn't ask for warmth when the night got too long and the temperature dropped too low to argue. They made it. They didn't think they would be comfortable. They made survival possible, and that's what made them different from the rest of us. We live in a hot place, but we still say we're cold. They lived in the winter and thought it was just another night. You didn't need to be brave to live in the mountains. You needed both mental and physical insulation. Mountain men quickly learned that the best way to stay alive was to dress like a small bear and act like they were already dead. They wore layers not to look good, but to make deals. The shirt came first, usually made of wool and sometimes regret. Then there was a vest, a coat, and a thick layer of fur on top of that. Could have legally cast a vote as someone else. By the end of winter, most of them looked like furniture that had learned how to walk. No one ever thought to wash those layers. Water, soap, and even the idea of cleanliness all froze. The smell was like its own world, a mix of sweat, smoke, animal fat, and bad choices. You could follow a mountain man for a long time before you saw him. Wolves did. Most of the time, they chose to go the other way. Their coats were heavy, their hats were silly, and their boots were always wet. Most of the time, each piece of clothing told a story about failure. The patch on the shoulder, the close call with fire, and the seams near the knees all show that the person fell and then swore creatively. A mountain man's clothes weren't so much about looking good as they were about getting through another conversation with the weather, but the layers weren't just cloth, they protected them from going crazy. If you've been alone for weeks and your only conversation partner is your echo, it's a little heavy on your shoulders. Reminds you that you're still alive. The fur, the smell, and the constant pain. But it kept you connected to the real world, no matter how bad it was. People today talk about winter clothes. Mountain men talked about not dying. They didn't wear jackets from high-end brands. They wore what was left over from their meals. The more stylish trappers might have worn fringed coats and moccasins, but underneath the looks, they were all just cold and stinky philosophers talking about fate and firewood. By the time spring came, and the snow finally, when they melted, they would peel off those layers like tree bark, showing the pale, malnourished person inside who was blinking, dazed, and wondering why he ever left a warm bed for this life. But as soon as the next winter came, they did it all over again. It was addictive because it wasn't easy to stay alive. Mountain men didn't eat for fun. They ate to keep their bodies warm. Calories didn't give you nutrition. They were firewood for the body. It worked if it burned. You died a little if it didn't. In a more poetic way, dinner was whatever didn't kill you first. They boiled, roasted, or sometimes just gnawed on things that moved slower than they did. People thought beaver tail was a treat. Elk tongue was a treat. The rest of the animal was just fur-covered meat. It was gold if it had fat. It was a lesson if it didn't. The menu changed based on how hungry you were. You might get rabbit stew on good weeks. You might have to eat the same rabbit twice in a bad week. Jerky was the main dish, the dessert, and helping with morals. It was hard enough to break teeth, but that was okay because all they had to do was not get an infection. They didn't hunt in silence out of respect for nature. They did it because chewing too loudly could scare away their dinner. Not hitting a shot wasn't just a failure. It was a week of hunger and regret. They learned how to use every part of an animal: bones for broth, hides for shelter, sinew for sewing, and the smell to keep people away. Salt was worth its weight in gold. You didn't. Add spices to food to make it taste better. You added spices to make it last longer. They only had one spice mix: desperation and soot. When they ran out of supplies, they had to be creative. They ate their horses, their belts, and even the boiled soles of their boots when things got really bad. It was called leather soup. They may have called it other things as well, but language tends to break down when you eat shoes. There was no movement from farm to table. Everything was what you caught before it froze. They made coffee from roasted chori, and whiskey was just medicine that was also fun. People talk about clean eating and count macros these days. It was easy for a mountain man to eat. It was good if it kept you warm. You wouldn't be able to complain if it didn't. They didn't eat to stay healthy. They ate to stay alive, which was already a big deal in their world. At the end of the day, if it ended, the mountain men would gather around the only nice thing they had: a small fire that wouldn't go out no matter how hard they tried. Did. That flickering orange light wasn't just heat, it was a circle of smoke, half burned wood, and bad stories that showed what civilization was like. During the day, they didn't talk much. The wind was too loud, the work was too hard, and people mostly just grunted and swore. But at night, when the snow hissed outside the fire's reach, words began to crawl out. That's when you heard the ideas of men who had seen too much cold and not enough kindness. They would sit hunched over. They were under furs, or their beards stiff with frost, and they were staring into the fire like it owed them an explanation. One guy would mumble something like, "Ain't nothing colder than regret," and another guy would nod, even though it didn't make sense. After the third sip of whiskey, everything made sense. Firelight turned trappers into thinkers. Every crackle was a sermon, and every spark was a reminder that warmth doesn't last. They would talk about what was important: women, whiskey, the weather, and how all three could kill you if you didn't give them enough credit. There were times when silence took over, not the nice kind, the kind that pushed against your ribs until you remembered how lonely you really were. The fire was a friend, a witness, and in some ways a place to confess. It didn't make a decision, it didn't stop working, and it died just when you needed it the most. Each man had his own way of lighting a fire. Some people poked it over and over again, as if doing so would prove they could still keep it alive. Others sat perfectly still, as if they were in a trance, like they were looking at the last bit of warmth in the world. In a way, they were out there. Ideas weren't what philosophy was about. It was about staying power. You didn't talk about what life means. You weren't sure if your fingers still worked. A full belly and a dry pair of socks were all that mattered. The fire didn't help them with their problems. It just made them remember that they still had some. But in that small circle of heat and flickering light, the universe made sense for a short time. And that was all it took. For the men who lived in the mountains, sleep wasn't a break. It was a short break from death. You didn't go to sleep. You just stopped moving and hoped that nothing big, hungry, or cold would come along and bother you. Like big rats, they slept in caves, under trees, or buried in snow. It was a good thing if you had a fur blanket. If you had two, you were probably sharing them with fleas that had been there for a long time. There were no pillows, no tents, and no way to be comfortable. People who could afford to be warm without working for it were comfortable. The flame was your roommate, and not a very good one at that. It had either went out too soon or burned too brightly and set something on fire, which was usually you. You learned how to get up so that you could wake up before your boots melted, but not before frost formed on your eyelashes. The air at night didn't whisper. It chewed. It crept into your bones like it was paying rent. You could wrap yourself in every hide you owned and still feel the cold air coming through the seams. The mountain didn't want you to die. It just wanted to see how close it could get. Sleep came in bits and pieces, stolen by shivers. You could close your eyes for 20 minutes, wake up, feed the fire, swear, fix your furs, and do it all over again. It was dangerous to dream. If you had too much of it, you froze before the next one. Being tired could sometimes make you creative. A snowbank turned into a bed, a saddle, a pillow, a half dead horse, and a warm bed for as long as it lasted. The smell wasn't great, but you stopped caring about how things looked around your third toe that got frostbite. It was never a sure thing that you would wake up in the morning. You didn't look at the clock, you felt your pulse. It was going to be a good day if you could still feel your nose. If you couldn't, you'd have less face to shave. They were too tired to sleep. They went to sleep because they had nothing else to do. It wasn't time to dream at night. It was to stay alive quietly, one heartbeat at a time, until the sun tried again. Mountain men didn't sleep much. Peace. It was time for maintenance. Your tools in the mountains could mean the difference between life and death or just wishing you had. There wasn't much room for weak metal or weak men. Every mountain man had what was basically a portable hardware store and a death wish. A gun, a knife, and enough traps to make a psychologist worry. Their rifles didn't fire in the cold. Their knives broke on frozen bone, and their traps ruined everything except what they were supposed to catch. To fix them, you needed a genius-level understanding of swearing. You didn't get new ones. There were no stores, no orders from men, and no friendly blacksmiths waiting in the woods. You just fixed it with sinew, bark, or hope and kept going. A hatchet wasn't a tool, it was a faith. You used it to chop wood, build shelters, carve stakes, and sometimes to say what you really thought. People treated flint and steel like sacred objects, keeping them close and safe like a baby. When you lost them, you learned how long a man could live on raw meat and sadness. Their lives were connected by leather cord, animal sinew, and frozen rope. You could tell a veteran trapper by how worn out and dirty his gear looked. Everything was broken, bent, or on fire in some way. It was good if it worked. If it broke, you called it new recycling. But the most important thing they had wasn't in their hands. It was in their minds. Being able to handle pain, hunger, and the general silliness of life. A mountain man could lose a finger or get burned, his hand, and he could still finish skinning an elk because stopping meant thinking, and thinking made him panic. People today freak out when their phone battery dies. For a mountain man, having a low battery meant running out of bullets while something with claws was running toward him. He didn't think too much. He didn't say anything. He either fixed it, changed it, or accepted that nature was winning again. Everything they had was borrowed from the land and not theirs. Metal rusted, leather rotted, and fire went out. But their patience, that was forever. Their tools may have broken, but their patience never did. And that's the kind of strength that factories couldn't copy. The body was the only teacher that mattered in the mountains, and it didn't believe in easy lessons. You weren't ready for the cold. You just had to put up with pain until your blood learned the syllabus. Every day was a biology experiment done by someone who dropped out of school at Ouch. At first, new people fought the cold. They stomped, they swore, yelled, and complained as if the weather would eventually say sorry. The mountain men, on the other hand, knew better. The body always changes faster than the mind. The mind screams, "This is crazy," but the body quietly changes into something that can sleep on ice and call it refreshing. Your skin got tougher than the leather you wore after a few winters. Nerves were dull. Pain became background noise. You stopped checking to see if you were bleeding because the answer was usually yes. Fingers turned into tools. Hooves grew on feet. You were no longer a man. You were a semi domesticated mammal who drank too much. They didn't talk about mental resilience because that would have meant having feelings, and most of those had frozen off a long time ago. You just kept going through punishment. Your body learned how to be more efficient, how to breathe slowly so your lungs didn't hurt, how to walk without using up too much energy, how to sleep without really relaxing. Cold exposure changed everything: your metabolism, your sanity, and your idea of fine. An experienced trapper could sit in the snow for hours, not moving, watching a trap line like a statue made of frost and regret. He didn't move around. He didn't blink. He had simply become enlightened by being cold. The cold changed them into something that couldn't be recognized. The weak got stronger or stopped being a group. Being strong wasn't a trait, it was a result. They didn't choose to be tough, they just never got around to dying. People today call that grit. People who lived in the mountains called it Tuesday. Their bodies. They learned how to live with pain, how to get through boredom, and how to keep going when comfort was just a rumor before their minds ever caught up. And by the time they finally got what was going on, the lesson was over. The test was already over for the body. The brain just graded it late. The mountain men didn't have pain as a symptom. It was in the forecast. It came every morning, like frost or bad news. You didn't ask if it would hurt. You just asked what kind of pain you'd feel today. Your own boots had teeth, claws, or sharp edges, just like everything else in the wild. The cold made your skin crack. The wind ripped your face off, and every muscle in your body was like, "No, I'm not going to do that." But you didn't stay away from pain. It was just noise in the background, like the wind, being alone, or wolves fighting over your trash. Infected cuts, blackened fingers, and swollen joints. You fixed it the old-fashioned way, whiskey and not accepting it. It was fine as long as it didn't kill you. At least you didn't if it did. Don't have to get up early anymore. There were no doctors, no bandages, and no help. You burned yourself, spat on your burns, and kept going because the snow didn't care that you were having a bad day. Having sore bones was a sign of honor. Frostbite was almost like shaking hands. You'd show off your blackened toes like trophies, proof that you had made it through another lesson from nature. Your mind was the only thing softer than your body, and the cold fixed that too. Pain made life easier. It got rid of luxury, distraction, and looking inside yourself. You stop worrying about philosophy when everything hurts. They didn't say anything because no one would listen. What could someone say, though? It's chilly. Yes, it was. That was the point. Pain was proof that you were still alive. If you were numb, you were losing. People today call mild pain burnout. A mountain man's burnout was a real fire. Today, we complain about sawbacks in office chairs. They called it chiropractic adjustment when they slept on frozen dirt. They were always torn between pain and not caring, too cold to feel and too stubborn to stop. Pain was not a punishment, it was a sign. You were still here, still alive, and still bothering the wilderness by not dying quietly. The mountain men learned the oldest truth in a world where no one ever said sorry. Pain isn't the bad guy. It's the only thing the cold ever gives you that is true. The mountain man lived alone, loud, grumpy, and always there when you didn't want it. For months for a while, the only heartbeat you could hear was your own. That even sounded tired. Out there was no one left to talk to who hadn't already frozen solid, so talking was optional. Your horse, dog, and rifle were your best friends, but not always in that order. The horse carried your things and made decisions for you. The dog shared your fire and sometimes your food. The gun kept you both from being eaten by someone else. It was a healthy, interdependent triangle of survival and a little bit of craziness. Men would go whole seasons without talking to anyone and would talk to themselves until their own voices sounded like those of strangers. You learned how to lose an argument with your echo. Being alone wasn't romantic. It was a different kind of hunger. You started naming things like your traps, your boots, and the campfire because you knew that something had to respond. Some guys couldn't handle it. The quiet was too deep and too long. They would hear voices in the wind or swear they were, saw shapes moving just outside of the firelight. It's possible that they did. Or maybe that's just how it is when you hang out with wolves and ghosts. Animals were the next best thing to friends. Some nights, the only sign of life was the horse's breath in the cold. Dogs were worth their weight in gold. A mix of hunters, guards, heaters, and therapists. If you lose your dog, you might as well dig two holes, one for him and one for your sanity. The wild didn't care that you were alone, but it changed how you listened. You learned to read the tree's movement and hear the wind's mood. Every noise turned into a sentence. The forest spoke in soft voices, and if you didn't know how to speak it, you didn't last long. People in the East thought that being rich was a sign of success. In the mountains, you measured it by the people you were with. A fire that stayed lit, a horse that didn't run away, and a dog that still wagged its tail when you said something dumb. Because even a mule's grunt was good when the nearest person was 100 miles away. Talking. In the mountains, fire was not a luxury. It was civilization, sanity, and a way to keep from becoming a historical curiosity. Every spark was a small miracle, and the man who made it felt like a god for about 5 minutes before it went out again. It was easy to start a fire when the weather was nice. It was performance art to light one in a blizzard. You had to fight frozen wood, frozen hands, and sometimes even your own frozen hope. The trick wasn't skill, it was just being stubborn. You didn't start a fire because you thought you could. You did it because dying was less convenient. They carried flint and steel like holy objects. Some people kept a coal alive in bark or moss that they held against their chest for miles through the snow. If you lost it, you would have to spend the night regretting it and maybe even getting burned. Self-administered, nature itself insulted you with wet wood. You'd swear, shave bark, and blow until your lungs gave out before your fire did. When it finally caught, that first flash of light was sacred, not in a metaphorical way, holy. You didn't turn away. You didn't move. You looked at it like it was an old friend who had come back from the dead. A good fire was more than just heat. It was like a blazing package of company, comfort, and mental stability. You had to respect the fire. It made fun of you if it was too small. It was too big and tried to kill you. You learned to read flames like you read moods. The hiss meant wet wood. The pop meant that things were going well. The loud whoosh meant that you had just burned your last pair of gloves. Fire made food safe to eat. Fear is manageable, and nights that are bearable. It was also a teacher. It went away when you got lazy. If you don't pay attention, it will punish you. Fire didn't let go. It just caught fire. Each mountain man came up with his own way of doing things. Some people talked to it in a low voice. People fed it like it was alive, because it was the only thing in that frozen world that really was. You remember how fragile warmth was when you sat next to it and your back was cold and your face was burning. Fire was the start of civilization. It also ended here. The mountain men didn't have thermostats. They made it through. We traded one for the other at some point. Between then and now, we forgot that warmth used to mean work, that it took more than just remembering to pay the heating bill to stay alive. They weren't afraid of being uncomfortable. They talked to it. The cold taught them how to be patient, humble, and strong by making mistakes that froze them. We now have electric blankets and motivational quotes about pushing yourself out of your comfort zone instead. People usually say this when they are sitting inside where it's warm. They knew that the cold wasn't their enemy. It was a teacher who graded on a curve, and if you failed, you were buried. But the lesson stayed with me. You learned to respect nature because it didn't care about your reasons. These guys could smell a snowstorm coming. A lot of people today need a weather app to find their way to their front porch. When things went wrong, they didn't freak out. Things never went right. You either fixed them or froze them. They didn't say it was resilience. It was called Tuesday. And they didn't complain because no one was listening, which is probably why they got so much done. We forgot that comfort and ability are two different things. We've made a world where Wi-Fi, delivery apps, and anger are all necessary for survival. Friction, fat, and fire were important to the mountain men. They worked for every meal, every degree of warmth, and every breath of air that didn't freeze in their lungs. The cold took away everything but the truth. You don't have control. You never were. Nature only lets you think you are, sometimes. They didn't make hard times sound romantic. They didn't call it the easy life. It wasn't easy. It was cruel, lonely, and uncaring, but it was true. We forgot that being comfortable doesn't make you stronger. It takes its place. The mountain men knew that cold was how life usually was. It was a privilege to have them anything warm, safe, or easy. They didn't complain about the cold when the fire went out and the frost came back. They simply pulled the blanket. Figures. That's not despair, that's wisdom. By the middle of the 1800s, the age of the mountain men was fading away like the snow they had lived under for years. The trade in furs fell apart. As civilization moved west, railroads, telegraphs, and too many people who thought frostbite was a myth came with it. The wilderness was getting smaller, and so were the men who lived there. They didn't all die at once. They went away. Some became guides for people who were moving to the area, muttering warnings that no one paid attention to. Some people opened trading posts and spent their last winters selling coffee that cost too much to people who called it an adventure. Some of them just went deeper into the mountains and never came back, which was, to be honest, the most poetic thing they could have done. The world went on. It was easy to get warm, normal to be comfortable, and you accidentally survived. The same mountains that used to be hard for men to climb now had vacation homes. People who sat by those fireplaces never knew they were, staring at the ghost of a world that was harder, a world where you had to work for every degree of heat. The mountain men knew something that people today still don't get. The cold isn't mean. It's true. It doesn't act like something it's not. It doesn't care who you are, what you believe, or how much insulation you can afford. It only asks one thing: are you able to adapt? They answered that question in the only way they knew how, by living long enough to become legends and dying long enough to be not remembered. The bones became part of the land. Their names faded into the streams and valleys, and their legacy died out like the last ember of a campfire that wasn't cared for. But the lessons are still there, buried under every snowfall and whispered in every gust of wind that shakes a cabin door. The cold still talks the same way. We just stopped paying attention. The mountain men left behind a truth that was so simple that it could survive extinction even in that frozen silence. Warmth doesn't last long. Cold is, for all time, and the only thing that ever made us human is the thin line between life and death. The first thing that catches your eye in a medieval kitchen isn't the food, it's the smoke. It rolls and twists like a living thing coming out of the big open hearth that is the room's main feature. This isn't your neat, modern stovetop with its polite gas flame. No, this fire is big enough to roast a whole boar, heat a bathtub-sized cauldron, and smoke half of it. The family to do what they wanted before breakfast. But this smoky mess was the center of every medieval home. Here, cooking wasn't just a chore, from the peasant's hut to the lord's manor. It was a mix of ritual, chemistry, and a little bit of witchcraft. The hearth was a place where people lived and believed in magic. Housewives stirred the pot with one hand and crossed themselves with the other. They whispered that the pot had to turn clockwise, or the devil would ruin the meal. A good cook was like a magician. She had to coax life from ingredients that were often not very good. Sawdust was sometimes used to stretch bread. It was thick enough to chew, and when you could afford it, you had to smoke or salt the meat to keep the worms away. There were no forks, just fingers, knives, and a spoon now and then for soups and stews. Sharing a bowl meant sharing germs, and the idea of eating clean meant wiping your hands on the nearest piece of bread or apron. But even with all the rough edges, there was art here: cinnamon, pepper, and other spices. Traders who risked their lives to bring saffron over mountains and deserts were very lucky to find it. It was like showing off a Rolex at dinner to sprinkle imported pepper on your stew. The hearth also showed who was in charge of the group. In big castles, whole groups of cooks worked over several fires, turning spits by hand, boiling sauces and baking pies that could feed a whole army. The fire in peasant cottages was smaller, but just as important. It was the only flame that kept the family warm and alive. The winter, every spark was important. Fire wasn't just a tool in the kitchen in the Middle Ages, it was life itself. It made your dinner, lit up your night, and put your lungs to the test. A simple truth started every meal in medieval Europe. What you ate told everyone who you were. The poor man's bowl and the noble's platter told two very different stories, and both were affected by class, weather, and luck. For peasants, the soil was where they got their food, and sometimes they didn't want to. Barley, rye, and oats were staples that were boiled into a thick soup that could hold a spoon up. It wasn't done if it wasn't gray. Kitchen gardens grew vegetables like leeks, onions, and cabbage. Herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme made boring food taste better. Meat was rare and valuable, so it was often saved for special occasions like holidays, weddings, or the rare chicken that had stopped laying eggs. Most peasants would have known what salted herring tasted like better than roast beef. But for the rich, the kitchen was a place of excess. Noble families wanted entertainment, and food was the stage. They roasted swans whole and then dressed them in their feathers for dramatic effect. People stuffed peacocks, covered them in gold, and paraded them around like trophies. The rich people of the Middle Ages loved the idea that a meal could also be a show, something to remind everyone at the table that they had the right to eat too much. There was also a difference in color and spice between the classes. Nobles wanted saffron for its golden glow, pepper for its bite, and sugar for its sweet taste. All of these things were brought along trade routes from Venice, Cairo, and the East at a high price. A little spice could make you look worldly. You might look poor if you don't have it. Even the simplest cook knew that taste wasn't just about enjoyment, it was about having power. But there was also a useful side. People didn't just eat food, they kept it like a treasure. Salted, smoked, and pickled stores could be the difference between living through the winter or dying of hunger. Honey, the sweetener of choice in the Middle Ages, was also used as medicine and a preservative, evidence that nature's pantry could both heal and feed. In the medieval kitchen, food wasn't just something to eat. They were social currency, signs of faith, and signs of good luck. A whole way of looking at the world was boiled down to what fit in your pot. Spice was the medieval kitchen's secret weapon. Not the kind you put on your fries, but things that are worth their weight in gold. Weight of gold. Cinnamon from Ceylon, black pepper from India, and cloves that are so rare that having a pouch of them could make you the envy of a court. These weren't just spices, they stood for power, wealth, and class. All of these were brought across continents by traders who risked pirates, plagues, and deserts to bring flavor. Medieval food might taste as strange to modern palates. That's because sugar was also thought of as a spice, a beautiful white luxury from the East. Nobles didn't just add sugar to desserts, they put sugar in sauces, fish, and meats. A roast could be glazed with honey and sprinkled with cinnamon, and wine could be boiled with cloves and served hot to guests as a sign of wealth. The end result was a taste world where sweet and savory tastes mixed. Think of a turkey leg and gingerbread. But behind the glitz, spices had a darker purpose. They were the best ways to hide. Before refrigerators, meat often came with its own personality, and it wasn't a good one. Spices could mask the smell of decay and turn questionable cuts into tasty treats. The cook from the Middle Ages knew this trick well, but they would never say so at the feast. But spices did more than cover up sins. They also showed how superstitious people were. Doctors in the Middle Ages thought that food changed the body's four humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile are all types of bile. It was hot and dry, which was perfect for balancing out cold diseases. Cinnamon was said to warm the heart, and saffron was said to lift the soul. So when your Lord put nutmeg on his pudding, he wasn't just showing off, he was trying to keep his sadness away. The spice trade changed the world in the Middle Ages. Venice became rich by acting as a middleman between the East and the West. Kings taxed pepper like gold, and cooks, who used to be lowly servants, became minor celebrities in noble courts for mastering the strange tastes of faraway lands. In the kitchen of the Middle Ages, spice wasn't a garnish. It was global power ground into dust. Each peppercorn told a story of victory, trade, and culinary ambition. Even in A, people still wanted to be sophisticated, even though there were no forks. In the Middle Ages, cooking was part art, part improvisation, and part controlled chaos. Don't worry about the recipe book. Cooks in the Middle Ages didn't use teaspoons or grams to measure. They used their gut, a good handful, a little while, or until it smelled right to measure. And because every fire burned differently and every pot had its own quirks, two cooks could make the same meal and get completely different results. One is tasty, and the other could kill you. People worked in the kitchen of a noble household like a living machine. There were spit boys, who were usually young and unlucky, whose only job was to sit by the fire for hours and turn meat so that it cooked evenly. There were skulls that scrubbed cauldrons black with soot, kneaders who wrestled bread dough like prize fighters, and master cooks who planned everything like generals before a battle. Orders flew, pans clanged, dogs waited for scraps, and the smell of roasting meat mixed with the smell of wood smoke and perspiration. There was real science, or what passed for it, even though there was a lot of excitement. The theory of the humors told cooks what to do. If you don't balance your ingredients, you could throw your body off. It needed heat if it was too cold, like fish or lettuce, maybe a little ginger or a little wine. Food was more than just taste. It was about keeping your body and mind healthy. Mistakes still happened, though. A feast could go wrong if there is too much salt. A smoky fire could turn a whole boar black, and undercooked, poultry could make a whole noble family run to the bathroom. No thermometers, no timers, and no second chances. A good cook's reputation was everything. If they made one bad dish, they could lose their job or, worse, get a beating from an angry lord. But when it worked, cooking in the Middle Ages could be great. We made everything from scratch by firelight, including pies filled with quail and almonds, sauces thickened with bread and wine, and pastries filled with figs and honey. It was dirty, tiring, and sometimes dangerous, but also very creative. In the medieval kitchen, chaos was a part of the process, and being a master meant being able to control it long enough to make something good for both the body and the mind. You need to see the difference between a feast and a famine to really get medieval cooking. Kings and lords had endless banquets, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted boar, almond tarts, and goblets of spiced wine. On the other hand, there were the lean years when peasants lived on watery pottage and old bread, hoping that next year's harvest wouldn't let them down. Bread, hoping that the harvest next year wouldn't let them down. Feasts were more than just eating, they were shows for the public. Every course told the rank and wealth of the person. Nobles didn't opt to eat. They showed their power by having a lot of things. They didn't serve roasted peacock because it tasted good. No, it didn't. It was served because it looked great. Feathers were put back on and gold plated like a trophy in food form. And while the guests clapped for the show, the servants probably ate on. If they were lucky, they could find leftovers behind the kitchen doors. There were rules of etiquette at the high tables, of course, but no forks. Nobles used knives and trenchers, which were thick slabs of stale bread that they ate off of. The rich also ate, but they sat further down the hall with servants or lower-ranking guests. They often ate the same food, but it was colder and in smaller portions. The line between being noble and being a servant was literally measured by how close you were to the salt cellar. To sit above the salt meant you mattered. You were only decorative below it. For the peasants, eating was more about staying alive than about ceremony. People ate together, usually from a pot in the middle of the table. The portions were basic but filling. Barley stew with bits of turnip or leeks. If luck was on your side, you might get a piece of bacon. But even among the poor, it was sacred to eat together. Food brought the family, the village, and the season together. After every meal, there was superstition. If you break bread the wrong way, you might get bad luck. It was a sin to waste salt. Eating, not saying worse, was like asking for bad luck or an upset stomach. The medieval kitchen was never just about food, whether it was for kings or shepherds. It was about tradition, reputation, and strength. A show where each dish told a story of faith, fear, and survival. If medieval cooking had a spirit, it lived in its recipes. These weren't just spices. Each of them was a spell that would turn the plain into a god. A roast goose without a source was a missed chance. A fish without it, a deed. of not caring. Medieval cooks thought making sauce was an art. They thought it was a way to balance the four humors, hide tough meat, and show off their style. Galantine, a thick, spiced mix of breadcrumbs, broth, and vinegar, was one of the most popular. It was often colored with blood or saffron. Almond milk became a base for richer tables. It was made by mixing crushed almonds with water to make a creamy liquid that could be used in everything from desserts to stews. There wasn't a modern vegan trend for almond milk. It was a clever idea from the Middle Ages, perfect for days when the church said no to dairy. Somehow, faith and flavor had to work together. After all, honey made almost everything taste better. In the Middle Ages, honey was worth more than gold, drizzled on pastries, mixed into wine, and even spread on meat. The end result was a food that was sweet in every way. In the Middle Ages, a sauce wasn't complete unless it had some contrast. Sweet and sour, hot and cold, dry and wet. The never-ending balancing act of tastes in food. When desserts, they looked like they were in a play. Guests who had already eaten too much were amazed by the jellies that looked like castles, the pastries filled with dates and figs, and the tarts that were decorated with nuts and spices. People called them subtleties, and they were edible sculptures, sugar dragons, marzipan knights, and pies that let live birds out when you cut them open. It wasn't only food, it was a way to show off. Even the most basic cook wanted to learn how to mix flavors. Vinegar and verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes, made things brighter. To fatty foods, herbs from the garden, like mint and hyssop, added layers of smell that mixed with the smell of wood smoke. Every ladle and mortar was like a philosopher's stone in miniature, trying to make the everyday into something almost holy. In the kitchen of the Middle Ages, sauces and sweets made it hard to tell the difference between what was needed and what was nice. They were the cook's biggest dream, not just to feed, but to enchant. In the Middle Ages, eating wasn't just about being hungry. The church was in charge of moral behavior. Every bite had a meaning in the big spiritual calendar. The food you ate and when you ate it could decide if you were holy or greedy, blessed or cursed. Not only were there seasons in the Middle Ages, but there were also fasts and feasts. During Lent, which lasts for 40 days before Easter, people couldn't eat meat, dairy, or eggs. Advent had rules that were similar. It was a rule that Fridays were fish days, and it still is today. The reasoning was both spiritual and useful. The church limited meat, which kept livestock alive and made the most of limited resources. But for cooks, these rules were both a nightmare and a chance to be creative. Fish saved the table for fasting. Herring, eel, and cod were all over the rivers, lakes, and coasts. Even though the fish might have traveled for weeks and been salted to near immortality by the time it got to the inner continent. In monasteries, creative cooks came up with ways to make meals for fasting into gourmet puzzles. They made fake meats and fish that looked like roast birds, or almond milk that looks like cream. In rich homes, fasting was an excuse to show off their wealth by serving exotic sea creatures like sturgeon or porpoise, which were thought to be good for Lent because they lived in water. Religion didn't just tell people what they could and couldn't do, it blessed what was okay. Feast days brought in a lot of food. Holy celebrations included roasted oxen, honeyed breads, and rivers of ale. Cooking for a saint's day or a wedding feast was a holy duty, a way to show love and enjoy life at the same time, even when meals are served. Followed the order of God. While the monks ate, they read from the scriptures out loud, which made eating a form of meditation. Peasants prayed before every meal and often left a little bit of bread for the spirits or the poor, because they knew that hunger was always close by. In a way, medieval food wasn't controlled by hunger, but by holiness. The church set the menu just like the seasons did. People were reminded that food was both a gift and a temptation, every loaf and ladle full. It was food for the body and a test for the mind. Before ovens, there was the hearth, which taught people how to be patient and make things up on the spot. The tools in a medieval kitchen were simple but smart, made for a time when there were no timers, thermometers, or ways to control the temperature. Iron cauldrons hung from chains over open flames, and the cooks stirred the fire with handfuls of wood to keep it at the right temperature. The hearth was more than just a place to cook. It was a battlefield where smoke, ash, and fire were always fighting for control. The tools themselves looked more like weapons than cooking tools. Heavy spits turned whole carcasses by hand or with the help of turnspit dogs. Small, long-bodied animals that were taught to run on treadmills that turned the meat. Iron skillets, pans, and ladles were so heavy that they could be used as weapons in a kitchen fight, which was always a possibility because of how stressed out everyone was. There were a lot of knives, but no forks, which was strange. Some people didn't like the fork when it finally came out, as a devilish prong, a useless substitute for the fingers God gave man. When they were available, people used the flame bread ovens. In a lot of villages, everyone used the same big oven. Each family marked their loaves with a unique symbol so they could tell them apart. Timing was the most important thing. If you waited too long, your bread would turn to charcoal. If you waited too long, the oven would be too hot. Cooks learned how to read heat by using their eyes, nose, and gut, just like sailors learned to read the wind. People drew water by hand. Salt was valuable, and the idea of being clean. At best, the surfaces were generous. The kitchen dog did a lot of the pre-wash by licking the dishes clean, and people washed their hands in shared bowls before and after meals. But even with all the dirt and smoke, these tools were something to be proud of. They linked the cook to a long line of people who had survived. Faith even got into the tools. People carved crosses into bread before baking it to keep evil spirits away. Before slaughter, knives were blessed. On feast days, holy water was sometimes sprinkled on the hearth itself. Every clang of iron and snap of fire told the same story. Cooking was hard work, dedication, and patience. The tools in a medieval kitchen weren't just tools. They were artifacts of human strength made in heat, faith, and hunger. When we think of food from the Middle Ages, We often picture something rough, greasy meat, bland bread, and bad hygiene. But under the soot and superstition were the building blocks of modern European cooking. The Renaissance didn't put an end to the medieval kitchen. It changed over time, and you can still see it in every spice rack on Sundays. Roast, and all the old wives' tales about what we should and shouldn't eat. The idea of balanced diets came from the need to keep humors in balance. Doctors like Hildegard of Bingen wrote about the moral and medical effects of food, which is similar to the nutritional science we know today. Making sauces, which involves mixing sweet, sour, and spicy flavors, was the first step toward French hot cuisine hundreds of years later. Even the medieval practice of serving meat with fruit and sweet glazes lives on in dishes like glazed ham or cranberry sauce for dinner on Christmas. The spice trade, which was once the center of medieval luxury, changed the way the world did business and explored. Columbus's shortcut to India that didn't work. It was about spices, the same simple ingredients that gave a medieval stew its smell made Venetian merchants, North African traders, and Arab navigators rich. Pepper built empires, cinnamon made people want to travel, and nutmeg could start wars. This smoky past even shaped how people eat. The shared trencher turned into one plate. Hand washing before meals turned into napkins and utensils. The shared hall became the private dining room. Eating was less about getting through the winter and more about being civilized. But the spirit of the medieval meal, which was communal, symbolic, and celebratory, still lives on in the quiet corners of the modern kitchen. You can still hear the echoes of that old fire, the stew on the stove, the bread rising in the oven, and the clove you crush into your cider all tell stories from the Middle Ages. Food was a reflection of class, faith, and imagination back then, just like it is now. The medieval kitchen shows us that food is more than just fuel. It reflects the time it was made. In a world where faith and fire ruled, cooks didn't just feed people, they gave culture food. Their legacy lives on in every meal that still tries to find a balance between comfort, flavor, and meaning. In the middle of France in the 17th century, between the Lier River and fields of wheat, there was a quiet town called Luda, place that should have been completely forgettable. Its streets were narrow and paved with cobblestones. Its churches were simple, and its people were religious in the way that small towns are when they don't know what's going to happen in the world. Cardinal Richelieu ruled France with an iron fist, and his policies had made it harder for people in the country to be free. Loudun, which had once been semi-independent and friendly to Protestants, had to give in to the Catholic crown's growing power. The people complained in private, prayed in public, and looked at each other with a mix of devotion and suspicion, doubt. It was a time when fear and faith went together. Demons were real. People thought they were behind every sickness, every temptation, and every sleepless night. Priests talked about hellfire. Women talked about witches in hushed tones, and doctors had more problems than solutions. The air in Ilden was thick with incense, gossip, and fear, which are all bad things. The big Ursuline convent stood in the middle of this fragile calm. Young women lived behind its walls, from rich families who sent them there to find holiness or at least stay out of trouble. Their lives were very structured: prayers before dawn, silence after sunset, and no talking to men except when confessing. The convent was supposed to be a safe place. Instead, it would be the scene of one of Europe's most terrifying cases of mass hysteria. People in Loudun were used to hearing rumors. By nightfall, a missing chicken could turn into a story about witchcraft. But even they weren't ready for what would happen next, the screams coming from inside the convent, where nuns were said to be writhing on the floor, cursing in voices that weren't their own, and the rumors that a local priest had consorted with the devil himself. France was obsessed with purity in the 1630s, including body, faith, and thought. Anything that threatened it had to be burned, exorcised, or killed. Soon, Loudun would find out what happens when a community that fears sin more than truth looks for evil where there isn't any. The demons were coming, but they weren't the same ones that are in the Bible. At the center of the Loudun affair was a man who was both brilliant and doomed: Father Urbain Grier. He was everything a priest in the 17th century shouldn't be: good-looking, well-spoken, full of himself, and dangerously charming. People came from miles around to hear him preach, but not because they thought he was inspired by God. They came because they liked watching him act like a stage on the pulpit. He spoke with the flair of an actor and the confidence of a nobleman, and even his critics had to admit that he was magnetic. Grandier was as smart as he was defiant. He made fun of the church leaders, stood up to the town leaders, and refused to follow Cardinal Richelieu's rules. Grandier openly defended Loudun's independence, which made him a political nuisance because it was one of the last towns with Protestant roots. But it wasn't his political views that would get him in trouble. It was his charm. Whispers followed him around like incense smoke. Women of all social classes, both noble and common, came to him for confession, and many stayed longer than they should have. People said that he had kids, seduced widows, and used his visits to churches for things that didn't need the Bible. His enemies, and there were many, waited patiently for the right scandal to come along and ruin him. The Ursuline nuns came to town, and that's when the scandal broke. Grandier was the best choice for spiritual advisor for their new convent because he was the most well-known priest in Luda. But when he turned down the job, saying he had other things to do, he accidentally sealed his destiny. The prioress of the convent, Sister Jeanne d'Arc, was hurt by the rejection. She was a woman whose faith was as strong as her imagination. Sister Jeanne started saying that Grandier haunted her dreams not long after he said no. She said that at night he came into her cell and whispered temptations and caresses. His shape was both angelic and demonic. Her confessions spread through the convent like fire. In just a few weeks, other nuns also started to have visions of Grands, ghostly visits, demons crawling through their rooms, and sin pretending to be holiness. A ghost had taken the place of a priest. A convent had become a theater, and Loudun was about to lose it. At first, It was quiet. Behind the convent walls, there were a few sleepless nights, whispered prayers, and nervous laughter. But things changed quickly. In the chapel, one by one, the Ursuline nuns started shaking, screaming, and falling down. They used strange voices, swore in Latin they had never learned, and said that they felt invisible hands touching them in the dark. Some people rolled on the floor in pain. Some people yelled Grandier's name as if he were both their enemy and their savior. Sister Jean d'Ange was the loudest of the group. Her confessions turned into performances that were long, emotional, and strangely interesting. She told how Grandier's ghost came into her cell at night, his face shining and his words blasphemous. She swore that he brought an army of demons into the convent to seduce and corrupt them. She gave spirits terrible names like Leviathan, Behemoth, and Astaroth, and said they fought for her soul. At first, the local clergy thought it was just hysteria or a sickness that was spreading, but the behavior spread too quickly and too dramatically. Almost every nun was possessed within a few days. They scratched the altar, floated in fits, and yelled curse words that would make sailors blush. Witnesses swore they saw things that couldn't be true, like nuns floating inches above the ground and holy water boiling in, its font and the crucifixes shaking on the walls. People came to see the convent. News of the possessed Ursulines spread beyond Loden's borders, bringing in priests, doctors, and just the people who were curious. Many exorcists came with relics and holy water, ready to fight Satan himself. The screams of the nuns became the new sound of the town. There was a lot of talk about devils, but the drama had a very human feel to it. When there was an audience, many people noticed that the possessions became more theatrical, present. The women seemed to know who was watching them, whether they were priests, nobles, or soldiers. Their fits got worse and their voices got louder. Some people fainted in a big way, while others said they could see Grandier's face in the dark. The church started to look into things seriously when they saw both danger and opportunity. If the devil had picked Lowen, France needed a win and someone to blame. And who better to play the bad guy than the rebellious, unrepentant priest who was already rumored to have seduced half the town? The stage was ready. The exorcisms were about to start. By 1633, Loden had become a holy and showy circus. The convent's once quiet halls were filled with screams, chants, and the sound of chains clanging together. People no longer kept exorcisms secret. They were plays for the public. People gathered outside the convent gates to hear the nuns scream, and priests held their ceremonies with all the drama of a play. Every fit, every curse, and every cry for help got gasps and applause. From the people watching, Sister Jean de Saulnes was at the center of the storm, and her fits got worse every day. She contorted her body into shapes that were impossible, spit out holy water, and said she saw demons flying over the altar. According to the clergy, she floated a few inches off the ground during one exorcism, with her eyes rolled back and her mouth foaming. This was proof that Satan had moved into Loden. But John seemed to get a strange boost of energy from the attention. She started to talk in big, loud voices, calling herself as both Grandier's sorcery victim and Christ's bride. Exorcists came and went, all wanting to make a name for themselves. Father Lacans and Father Trinil led the ceremonies with a lot of drama, yelling orders at unseen spirits and questioning the nuns as if they were in a courtroom. "Who told you to come?" they asked. The answer was always Urban Grandier, his name. It seemed that demons were very consistent in what they said. The church's leaders started to write things down. Reports of the possessions were sent to Richelieu's agents, who saw a chance in the chaos. Grandier had spoken out against Richelieu's policies in public. Heaven itself seemed to be blaming him now. What better way to get rid of a political nuisance than to have a demonic scandal linked to his name? In the meantime, the exorcisms got worse. They made the nuns pray, fast, and stay still for hours at a time. Some people passed out from being too tired. Some people got wounds that they said were caused by claws that couldn't be seen. Doctors started to think it was hysteria, but the church's strong belief drowned out their doubts. Every new fit was proof that they were possessed. Every scream was a sermon against sin. By the spring of 1634, Loudun had become a place where pilgrims, gawkers, and zealots all wanted to go. Father Grandier could already feel the noose tightening around his soul and neck from far away. The town's faith had turned into an obsession. Father Urban Grandier was arrested in 1634, and by then he was already guilty. Made a choice. The church didn't need proof. There was theater. The possessed nuns in Loudun had called his name too many times for him to ignore. The priests in charge of the exorcisms said they had found signed agreements between Grandier and the devil himself, written in Latin and sealed with blood. The papers were so poorly written that they had signatures from demons like Lucifer, Leviathan, and even Beelzebub, as if hell had a formal registry. But logic wasn't welcome in the courtroom in France in the 1600s. Grandier was pulled through. The streets, where the same people who used to admire his wit and sermons made fun of him. He stayed calm and said he was innocent, a victim of slander, jealousy, and politics that pretended to be piety. But Richelieu's agents had already caught wind of the chance. The trial was no longer just about faith. It was a chance to get back at a local critic of the crown. The church and state worked together in a scary way. Witnesses came forward in large numbers, including servants, exorcists, even the nuns, each wanting to show their loyalty to God or save their own skin. Their stories were almost too crazy to believe. They said that Grandier had flown through the windows of the convent, that he had sent demons in the form of black cats, and that his breath alone could corrupt pure souls. The courtroom, which was full of people, loved it. It was a mix of a sermon, a show, and a witch trial. Grandier laughed when the judges showed him the so-called demonic contract, a deadly mistake. His confidence was seen as the devil's pride, and his mockery was seen as arrogance. He was tortured for days to get him to confess, and priests crushed his legs between wooden boards as they demanded he repent. He wouldn't admit to witchcraft, though, even when he was in pain. I am only guilty of offending powerful men, he said. But Lun had no place for reason anymore. The verdict was set, and the execution date was set. The priest who once stood in the pulpit preaching salvation was now condemned as the devil's mouthpiece. Loudun had found its scapegoat, and France its holy victory. On August 18th, 1634, Loudun gathered to witness what was billed as a divine victory, the burning of Father Urban Grandier. The town square had been transformed into a holy stage. Soldiers kept order, priests led hymns, and merchants sold food to the swelling crowd. Everyone wanted to see the devil's servant perish. The irony, of course, was that the only fire born of hell that day was the one lit by human hands. Grandier was brought out in chains, looking gaunt and broken from torture. His legs were crushed and his body was bruised, but his face was eerily calm. Eyewitnesses said he looked more like a martyr than a sorcerer. The executioners gave him one last chance to confess, ask for forgiveness, and name his accomplices. He refused. Instead, he prayed out loud for mercy on those who were condemning him, saying that his soul was innocent even if his body was not. Before the flames were lit, one of the exorcists, Father Lactance, tried to. He blessed the fire and yelled for the demons to leave. But some say he died screaming a few weeks later, as if the act had cursed him. The crowd watched as the priest's robes caught fire, and smoke rose into the sky like incense. Some said they saw a white dove escape from the flames, the soul of Grandier rising. Others said the smoke made a mocking grin. When it was over, the church declared victory. The demons had been driven out, the witch had been killed, and Loudun was cleansed, but the air didn't feel clean. It felt empty. The nuns' fits continued sporadically, even after Grandier's death, their supposed deliverance proving as elusive as their demons. Outside of Luda, whispers began to spread. Some priests quietly questioned the trial's fairness. Physicians spoke of hysteria and manipulation, and even the king's court, once eager to please Richelieu, grew uneasy about the spectacle. Grandier's execution was meant to silence scandal. Instead, it immortalized it. He died claiming he was innocent, burned by a church that mistook politics for exorcism and faith for fire, and in the flickering light of his pee, Loudun's demons didn't go away. They just changed faces. When the flames died down, Loudun thought peace would return, but instead, the town fell into a strange silence. The kind that comes after hysteria has eaten its fill. The nuns, who were supposed to be free of their demons, continued to twitch, convulse, and scream during prayers. The church had destroyed its scapegoat, but the sickness of belief still lingered. Sister Jeanne d'Ez, the prioress who had first accused Grandier, became something of a celebrity. She traveled across France, recounting her ordeal as both victim and saint. Crowds gathered to hear her describe how Satan had possessed her body and how the Virgin had freed her soul. She even claimed to bear invisible stigmata as proof of her divine suffering. The church rewarded her piety with public admiration, the very fame she seemed to crave all along. Yet in her private writings, Jean admitted to haunting dreams of Grandier, not as a demon, but as a man whose face she could not forget. Guilt, perhaps, or something darker. For Ladon itself, the scandal was a curse that never faded. Trade dwindled, pilgrims stopped coming, and the town's name became synonymous with madness. The ashes of the priest had poisoned the soil of faith. Even years later, travelers stayed away from Loudun, saying it was still haunted, not by devils, but by the sins of its people. In Paris, scholars and skeptics began to talk about a different theory. Doctors like Gabriel Inde said that the nun's behavior wasn't demonic at all, but psychological, a frenzy caused by repression, isolation, and suggestion. This idea was radical, even blasphemous, but it hinted at something modern, mass hysteria, centuries before psychology gave it a name. Cardinal Richelieu, he was happy with his political win and moved on. Luda had served its purpose. One heretic was silenced, and one lesson was learned, but France would never forget the event. Loan's possessions became a stain on the church's robe, proof that faith can consume itself when mixed with fear. In the smoldering aftermath, the question remained, who had really been possessed, the nuns or everyone who believed them? In the years that followed, Sister Jeanne d'Assange went from being a scandalous accuser to near saint, a living relic of the Luda miracle. Her fame spread far beyond the convent walls. Nobles, bishops, and even the king himself summoned her to court, eager to witness the woman who had wrestled with demons and lived to tell the tale. She relished the attention. Her limp, the result of demonic torment, became part of her holy persona, and she described her suffering with the confidence of an actress who knew her audience adored every word. At each appearance, Jean recounted her visions. In detail, Satan's seductive whispers, the grotesque faces of the spirits that clawed at her, and her eventual triumph through faith. But her stories were fluid, embellished, evolving with every retelling. The demons became more monstrous, the miracles more vivid. When skeptics questioned her, she accused them of harboring hidden devils. It was a clever tactic. Doubt itself became proof of sin. Her newfound celebrity gave the church a convenient narrative. Jane was the emblem of divine victory. The church won against Satan, and the weak woman was saved by holy authority. She was shown off as proof that exorcism worked and that evil had been defeated. But behind her holy facade, Jean was haunted. In her private confessions, she said that she had nightmares of Father Grandier, not as the demon she had described before, but as a wounded man who was burning, silent and accusing. She would wake up shaking, torn between triumph and guilt. Some people at the time saw through the show. Writers and scholars whispered that Jan's fame was nothing more than a mask for political theater. They saw in her miracles the reflection of an entire nation's madness, a France where repression and religion danced on the same tightrope. But few dared to say it aloud. In her later years, Jean claimed to have been granted another miracle, a healing of her paralysis after a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Francis d'Al. Whether it was divine intervention or psychosomatic relief, she took it as a sign that her holiness was confirmed. Sister Jean died peacefully, cloaked. In reputation, yet surrounded by ghosts, one of them forever whispering her name in smoke and fire. The cult she inspired outlived her, a monument to hysteria, sanctified as faith. Centuries later, the story of the possessed nuns of Loudun still haunts Europe's imagination, a perfect storm of faith, fear, and forbidden desire. What happened in that small French town in the 1630s wasn't just an outbreak of hysteria, it was a mirror held up to an age when religion and politics were indistinguishable, when the line between the sacred and the obscene became so blurred that it was impossible to tell them apart. Historians have long debated what really happened. Some say the possessions were a collective psychological crisis caused by repression, isolation, and the suggestive power of authority. Others say it was political theater set up by Richelieu's agents to get rid of a defiant priest. And then there are those who think the nuns were victims of something deeper, the intersection of genuine belief and human need for meaning in chaos. Whatever the cause, Loudun remains a study in how fear once sanctified becomes unstoppable. Father Aubain Grandia's name endured as both villain and martyr. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire later cited his trial as proof of the Church's cruelty and superstition. In the 20th century, his story was reborn through plays, operas, and films. From Aldous Huxley's The Devils of Loudun to Ken Russell's infamous 1971 adaptation, The Devils, each retelling stripped away another layer of myth, revealing the same uncomfortable truth. That reason collapses easily when dressed in holy robes. Sister Jeanne d'Ange, meanwhile, remains a symbol of contradiction, part saint, part manipulator, part victim of her own creation. Her diary survives, filled with ecstatic visions and agonized remorse. Some see her as the first documented case of psychosomatic possession. Others as a tragic woman trapped by the expectations of a faith that demanded either purity or pission with no room between. Today, Loudun's ruins still, layer of myth, revealing the same uncomfortable truth. That reason collapses easily when dressed in holy robes. Sister Jeanne d'Ange, meanwhile, remains a symbol of contradiction, part saint, part manipulator, part victim of her own creation. Her diary survives, filled with ecstatic visions and agonized remorse. Some see her as the first documented case of psychosomatic possession. Others as a tragic woman trapped by the expectations of a faith that demanded either purity or pission with no room between. Today, Loudun's ruins still whisper their story. Tourists visit the spot where Grandier was burned, now marked by a simple plaque. The convent is long gone, but the echo of its screams lingers in every account. The case of Loudun reminds us that hysteria doesn't require demons, only fear, power, and a willing audience. And perhaps the most terrifying lesson of all, that belief, once inflamed, can burn brighter and crueler than any fire ever lit in that doomed French square. In medieval Paris, sin and salvation lived side by side, separated only by the width of a street. The same city that built towering cathedrals also built an underground network of desire. one hidden behind the scent of fresh bread and cheap wine. By day, monks walked the cobbled lanes, chanting psalms. By night, the same stones echoed with laughter, whispers, and the rustle of cloaks slipping into forbidden doorways. Paris was Europe's beating heart. Crowded, chaotic, and intoxicating, merchants shouted prices in the market, students from the Sorbonne debated theology, and beggars waited by the people would pay for coins or confessions. But behind this loud respectability, another economy thrived, one that traded not in gold or grain, but in pleasure. The Maison's closes were hidden between bakeries, taverns, and wine cellars. They were a discreet brothel, known only to those who could afford sin and silence. There were no signs or lanterns to mark them. A flicker of candlelight in an upstairs window, a curtain drawn twice, or a loaf of bread left intentionally uncut could serve as the signal. 4. People who knew what they were talking about said that Paris was a map of temptation drawn in invisible ink. The church thundered from the pulpit that lust was a mortal sin. But Parisian priests walked past these brothels every day. They preached against vice in sermons, then quietly blessed the men who profited from it. The truth was that the city's moral order depended on its hidden sins. Brothels were the pressure valves of a society obsessed with purity, places where men could indulge in what the church said was bad and then go back to confession. The brothels of medieval Paris were not just places of desire, they were mirrors. In their candlelight flickered the hypocrisy of an age that worshipped chastity but lived off temptation. Sin was not the city's secret, it was its second heartbeat. The women who lived and worked in the brothel of medieval Paris were ghosts in daylight and queens at night. Society called them sinners, but in the dim glow of tallow candles, they ruled small kingdoms of their own making. Most had not chosen this life. It had chosen them. Poverty, war, and hunger drove countless women to the city, and Paris, for all its grandeur, offered few options. A woman without a husband, family, or trade was invisible unless she sold what men most desired and most despised. Some came from the countryside, fleeing famine or the shame of bearing a child out of wedlock. Others were widows or wives abandoned by soldiers who never returned. For many, the brothel was less a moral fall than an act of survival. There at least they had food, warmth, and a roof, privileges not guaranteed to the respectable poor freezing outside. Inside the Maison Close, life had its own rules. Older women became maitresses, madams,